everyone. My name is Becker. I'm a tax reporter for Politico. I'm excited to be here with you guys today. We're here, our third conversation, first with a Democrat, Senator Bennet of Colorado. You've been a longtime leader on tax issues in the Senate. So what I want to get to is, this has been a Republican process so far. We've heard maybe one reconciliation bill, maybe two reconciliation bills. Senator Johnson, your colleague, floated 3 reconciliation bills today. So how do you influence this process as someone on the outside looking in or moving forward?
I actually think there's not much for us to do to influence it, although it is, to me, interesting that Senator Johnson made news here saying maybe 3 reconciliation processes. That's a lot of reconciliation processes. It's going to be interesting to see whether anybody else thinks that's a good idea. There's still a debate going on about whether it should be 1 or 2. No Democrat is going to have any influence on that, and I'm not sure what I would recommend. I think that obviously the person with the toughest job in all of this is the Speaker of the House, who's got to keep together that very, very narrow majority. And in the end, he may have an awful lot to say about what can get over the finish line there and whether that should be 1 or 2 or 3. I know there's a difference of opinion between the House and the Senate. But we can have an influence in the sense that we can raise our voices about the broader tax bill and what the House, what the Republicans are trying to do in Washington unilaterally as one party to our country and to the American people. That's less about the process than about the substance, but it's something we have to take our responsibility there very seriously, I think.
Okay. So, I mean, I think we could probably acknowledge there's a non-zero chance that Republicans have some issues as the year goes on. Are you guys sort of working on the side, like, say it gets to December and maybe this has to become a bipartisan process to extend some of the expiring tax cuts? Have you guys started working on like what you would want to see in that if it has to become bipartisan, if they need you in the end?
I don't think we're there yet. I think the likelihood of that happening is probably 0. Okay. If it did happen, though, I mean, if there were a catastrophe and all of a sudden they couldn't get it passed, maybe we could have a moment where people said, you know what, the debt and deficit in this country really is unsustainable, and despite all the rhetoric about tax cuts paying for themselves and everything else, that there could be a coalition of Democrats and Republicans that would come together and close over the rank and file, or the folks that are kind of leading the partisan battle on this, to create a set of choices that would be good over the long term for the American people in terms of the way our fiscal condition is operating. I think that's in some way, I mean, the likelihood of that I think is almost 0 and probably less than 0 with Donald Trump as our president. But at some point, we are going to have a bipartisan outcome. Like, I don't see the possibility of, I'm not saying this year, I don't think it will happen this year, but as Americans, we're going to have to get past this reconciliation for reconciliation for reconciliation if we are ever going to have a hope of bringing in line our revenue and our spending and be able to turn over our kids an undiminished view of what our country ought to be. I guess let me say that in a less complicated way. I don't feel like there's anything progressive about the debt and deficit that we have on this country right now. I think we're already constraining the choices that our kids and grandkids are going to have available to them because we've been unable to make those choices. And the only way we're ultimately going to be able to do that is in a bipartisan way. It's not going to happen in this season, but it could happen someday.
Mm-hmm. So as Republicans move on this process, I mean, there are things they could do that you would like more than others. I mean, you've been a longtime fan of expanding the child tax credit. You're not as big a fan of, say, like unlimited SALT. So, like, do you talk to your GOP colleagues who want to expand the CTC about like ways to do it? Like, are you having those conversations on the side about like, if you're going to do this, I think this might be a nice way to do it? Like,
yeah,
that sort of stuff.
Definitely. And I think they're reaching they're having debates within their own caucus about what they would want the CTC to look like. I was went to the inauguration this week and spent some time with folks from the new administration talking about the CTC and the shape of the CTC and listening to them talk about what they had learned during the course of the campaign. So we're trying to influence it everywhere I can. My hope for it is that we have as refundable as CTC as possible, whether Democrats are involved in the final shape of it or not, that the Republicans come to see the benefit that we all saw during COVID of lifting 50% of American kids out of poverty, reducing hunger by 25%. We are the richest country in the world, and we have one of the highest levels of childhood poverty in the industrialized world. As a former school superintendent, I can tell you we would be a lot better off as a nation if we cut that childhood poverty rate in half. There are Republicans who are now talking about that. J.D. Vance ran for vice president on a child tax credit, at least in its size, or the level, was even more generous than the one that Sherrod Brown and I had written years ago. The devil is in the details, and the question for us always is, how refundable is it going to be? Can you get to the poorest kids in America? And that's a conversation I continue to have, as you say, on the sidelines.
Did you get a sense, I mean, outside of the new vice president, that there's real interest in the new administration for expanding the CTC?
I think there is. I think I would have to say it's one of the top, priorities, as I understand it, from the Republicans. It does seem in conflict with a lot of the other things that they're trying to do in their tax bill. But I think ultimately an enduring CTC, and one that really does cut childhood poverty in a meaningful way and give the middle class a real tax benefit, for that to also to endure, we're going to need a bipartisan version of it ultimately.
Okay. So
and we could lay the seeds of that in this legislative year, I think.
Okay. So you think even if they do something in their bill this year, it could be just sort of a start, and then eventually there'll be a bipartisan agreement on it?
I think it's iterative by its nature, and they could get. I mean, I don't think of it as a start, but hopefully building on the work that we've already done.
Right. Yeah. Right. Okay. So to get back to sort of debt and what Republicans might add to the debt this year, I mean, one of the sort of very wonky in the weeds things we talk about here is sort of the current policy versus current law baseline. Your colleague Senator Johnson earlier talked about current policy being the way to go. I wonder, I can see you smirking already, so just
smirking. I'm laughing out loud. I enjoy the joy that we get to talk about this morning.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But tell us why you think that is a bad idea.
It's just, it's comical on its face. The idea that these tax cuts will pay for themselves, I think, is I think it's very widely understood that that's not true. That's rhetoric that has been used since Ronald Reagan was president. We have this interesting moment now that's very unusual in American history, where we've got the same administration coming back, So literally the ink is not dry on the effect of the last tax cuts. If the last tax cuts had done what they said they would do, that is to say, not cause any deficit, create some kind of magical economic growth that allowed us to cover over, and fill up the deficit, which they didn't, you wouldn't have the candidate for the nominee for Treasury Secretary saying that our deficit is a crisis and that we have to cut, he said, discretionary spending to pay for it only. And as you know, that's 17% of our annual budget is non-defense discretionary spending. Another 17% is defense discretionary spending. So together, that's 30%, 35% of the budget. So that's $1 out of every $3 that he's saying in his prepared statement for the Finance Committee. Listen to it, watch it. He's saying that's where all the cuts are going to come from to pay for this bill, which is going to cost the American people $4.6 trillion. You can't get those cuts out of $1 out of $3. It's impossible. So they're trying to have it both ways. They're trying to ring an alarm on the deficit, saying we have this massive problem. And on the other hand, they're trying to say that the Trump version 1 of the tax cuts didn't blow a $2 trillion hole in the deficit. And the American people are too smart for that. And they're going to figure it out, I think. And I was saying the other day during his hearing that, to me, I don't understand how people get away with this in Washington, D.C. If you were in any city in this country, in the north or the south, red or blue, it makes absolutely no difference. And the mayor of your town came to you and said, I'm going to borrow more money than I've ever borrowed before. And you said to the mayor, that worries me. I'm worried that you're going to borrow all that money. What are you going to spend that money on? Are you spending it on schools? And the answer is no. Are you spending it on infrastructure? No. Parks? No. Mental health? No, which we desperately need as a country. Healthcare? No. Making our schools better? No. What are you doing? What are you doing with the money? We're going to give it to the 2 richest neighborhoods in town and hope that it will trickle down to everybody else. And by the way, as it trickles down to everybody else, we're going to say that it's going to magically grow the economy in a way that will paper over the debt that we're incurring, not to fix your schools, not to fix your parks, not to fix, in the case of America, our national defense, but to pay for tax cuts for the richest people in our community. That is their tax plan. And it's a shame that we weren't able to defeat it at the polls, and we're going to have a hard time defeating it here. But we're going to be carrying those, that argument out to the American people, and I think they're going to be really discouraged to see what these guys really do. It's shocking, really, shocking. They are worried about the debt and deficit. They really are worried about it, and they don't think that we're going to cut our way there by slashing discretionary spending. But that's what this new Treasury Secretary has proposed before he's even in the job.
Mm-hmm. I think people, after hearing that, won't be surprised when you voted against him this week. He did not get a lot of support from your side of the aisle. Last time Janet Yellen, I think, was unanimously approved by the committee. I mean, why do you think that is? Do you think it is just sort of like, and some of what you're saying is that he's sort of part and parcel of the entire administration, and so, what has he done to sort of preserve opposition already, then?
I think that, I think anybody who's going to be in this job working for Donald Trump is going to be a master of trickle-down economics and the king of debt, which Donald Trump is. He proudly calls himself that, and he is. I think that we'd like to have a nominee who's somebody who's paid, his taxes in full and who's thinks that folks, the wealthiest people in America ought to pay their taxes like everybody else. And some of what came out in his in his paperwork suggested that he hadn't paid the full freight of his Medicare taxes, and I think that raised a lot of concern on our side.
Okay. I want to switch gears here a little bit. Republicans have talked somewhat about offsetting the costs of whatever they do this year. One of the ways they would consider doing that was to go after the clean energy credits that you guys passed. I know you're a big fan of a lot of those. Do you think they'll find some trouble in doing that? Because a lot of those credits have sort of opened up new plants, economic opportunities in a lot of red districts throughout the country.
A lot of, in Colorado, a lot of the places we've been celebrating those tax credits is the reddest parts of our state, because a lot of them benefit rural America. And if you've watched the politics of this, you probably have noticed that Mitch McConnell, for example, has not relentlessly attacked those credits the way that he relentlessly attacked Obamacare from the day that it was passed, because he believed Obamacare was not popular, whereas these credits are extremely popular, and the investments that are made in the Inflation Reduction Act, and for that matter, the infrastructure bill that we passed in a bipartisan way, those are popular with the American people too. I think they're going to have real trouble going after those because they're visible to people, and I think people will have something to lose. And again, they're going to be asking themselves, I think, and we're going to be asking as well, why in the world we would get rid of those tax credits so that we can pay for tax cuts for the wealthiest people in America. 50% of the benefit of the Trump tax bill goes to the top 5% of top 5% of Americans. 50%, 25% goes to the top 1% of Americans. Anybody, who has even had a casual familiarity with the state of the American economy for the last 40, 50 years knows that the problem in our economy is not that the wealthiest people aren't getting the benefit. They are getting the benefit. But working people and middle-class people in our country no longer feel that if they work hard, they're going to get ahead. Their families are going to get ahead. That if they work hard, their kids are going to be better off than they are. In fact, I'm really sad to say this, but this generation of younger Americans, if we don't get our act together, is going to be the first generation of Americans to have less opportunity, not more than their parents and their grandparents. And that matters a lot to me in this tax discussion. Because if we saw the opportunity to be able to reshore some industries and strengthen some supply chains here, and be able to try to give people, again, the chance to contribute to a manufacturing economy, to build stuff, to create more energy, and to diversify our energy economy in ways that actually will lift wages here rather than exporting everything overseas, that's something we ought to let work. But these guys may not want to do it because of their ideology on energy, and I do think they're going to have a hard time doing that.
Okay.
Fortunately, I don't think from their perspective that they're at all serious about paying for it, which is why my friend Ron Johnson was here telling you about
3, yeah.
whatever. What was the scoring again?
The current policy.
The current policy.
Yeah. Okay, so one of the other things you guys did when you were in control was you expanded funding for the IRS. Republicans have been clear since you did that they wanted to sort of pull that back. They've been somewhat successful in that, and then now with the new administration, there's been, they've essentially forced out a Senate-confirmed IRS commissioner. They've put like a special hiring freeze on the IRS. I mean, how concerned are you about what, the new scene is going to do to the IRS and the ability to collect revenue to, battle the debt?
I'm concerned about it. I mean, they've got a view that the IRS is, some horrible totalitarian agency. I don't know what it is exactly, but what they seem to be doing is trying to keep the wealthiest people in America from paying their taxes, And regular people in our country pay taxes. They have to pay taxes. They fill out their forms and they pay their taxes. And the folks that they're cutting at the IRS are the people that can go after folks that have complicated taxes because they're really wealthy and they're hiding what they pay. And it makes it easier for people that are trying to dodge their taxes if there are not people at the IRS, if there's no cop on the beat to do their job, which is why they always starve the IRS. There's probably not a brand in America that's worse than the IRS, which may be another reason why they go after it. I think it's too bad that the Biden administration didn't get some credit for the modernization that they're trying to do over there. And I think that it would be a wonderful thing if Americans could, for example, submit their taxes in a much more automated way so they could do it quickly, be secure in the knowledge that it was done properly, and then get on with the rest of their lives. We're one of the few industrialized countries where that's not true.
I think Elon Musk wants to do that too. So.
And by the way, I think that would be great. And there may be a lot of things that they're trying to do in terms of government reform that turn out to be things that I can support. I think that we're long overdue. And I hope we get some help. I mean, it would be useful to have some people that actually know something about writing software to help us think about the technology in the federal government. I've never seen a software implementation in the federal, state, or local government actually ever go well. I've rarely seen it go well in the private sector, but that would be a nice place for these guys to apply themselves. And I hope that that's what they were doing, sitting behind President Trump the other day when he was inaugurated, was thinking about how they could benefit the American people by helping us reform the way our agencies work, not sitting there trying to protect their ability to pass their fortunes on to their heirs tax-free, which is what they're able to do today because of how broken our tax code is. I'm sure that was not the reason they were there.
Yeah. So I'm assuming
We are not here. I almost expected signs up there saying, "Save, step up, save, step up." But
there's a few crowds that will understand what you just said. This might be one of them. Yeah. So I'm assuming you haven't met with the president's choice to lead the IRS, Billy Long, yet. I don't think he's met with many of your colleagues. Do you have concerns, A, about the precedent of essentially, these are supposed to be overlapping terms so that it wasn't just one president gets to choose his own IRS commissioner? And also, are you concerned about the specifics we've heard about this nominee, specifically that he may have been pushing the employee retention tax credit onto businesses that may not have been eligible and may not have wanted it, or that sort of thing?
I'm really worried about that. I read a little bit about that. I have not gotten to his portfolio yet, so I haven't. We're working our way through some other nominees right now, but I am worried about that. There was widespread fraud throughout the country on that tax credit that I'd like to not see replicated. So it's something that I'm going to be asking him about. And I'm sorry that the Biden leadership left, because I think they were doing a pretty good job and taking it seriously in a nonpartisan way. It'd be good to have people fill out their terms, but you can see it not just at the IRS, but Chris Wray at the FBI, who left early rather than filling out his term. I saw today that Washington, D.C. is not going to have the benefit of having a U.S. attorney who's actually from Washington, D.C. One is being imported from Missouri, I think it is, to come here. And you look at the decisions yesterday to pardon the folks that were engaged on January 6th. These are all things that erode, shatter, compromise our democratic norms in ways that I think we're going to pay for in the long run, and that's we're going to have to take it on. Obviously, we lost this election to Donald Trump. There's a lot of shame in that, I believe. I don't believe that it's Donald Trump's fault that he won. He ran and he won for the second time, and he told the American people what he was going to do. And the Democratic Party could not make a compelling case about why that was going to be bad for the American people. And I believe it is going to be terrible for the American people. Think about the kids that I used to work for in my old school district, who are mostly kids of color, mostly kids living in poverty, who are utterly invisible to Donald Trump, are utterly invisible to his administration, and yet we were not able to overcome his three-ring circus to be able to get us to a place where we had an enterprise here in all respects that was actually trying to work on behalf of the American people. This tax debate, I think, is going to give us a real opportunity to highlight those differences in ways that I think the American people will see and will understand.
So have you, in your mind, for this year, what is on taxes specifically? What is the best bad outcome? Essentially, what are
best bad outcome? I think the best. Let me say what the best outcome would be. The best outcome would be stopping this irresponsible extension of these tax cuts, which I mentioned earlier, benefit the wealthiest people in our country. 25% the top 1%, 50% to the top 5%, blows another $4.6 trillion in our deficit for nothing, for nothing. Like, we're not securing our national defense by doing this. We're not making it easier for people to read by doing this. All we're doing is giving tax cuts to the wealthiest people who don't need tax cuts at a time when we've got massive income inequality and a total lack of economic mobility. So there's no advantage to our country from doing that. If you add salt to this, you know, which which many people want to do, that's another $1.2 trillion, and in that case, it's even less. It's even more regressive than the underlying tax code. I mean, that's another 1.2 trillion on top of it. We might as well go out there and just light I can't do the math, 4.6 plus 1.2, light that on fire out in front of Union Station for all the good that it will do the American people. So there might be the opportunity to just say, we can't do it. We're not going to be able to afford it. This is insane. It is insane.
So would you be okay if everything expired?
I think you could get a bipartisan agreement for everything that is not the stuff that's going to the wealthiest people. You could get a lot for things that are $400,000 and above. I think you'd have a bipartisan agreement on that.
Okay. I think one of the interesting things about this now is that you guys were very opposed to the Trump tax cuts when they were passed, and I think you felt like you gained some political advantage from that law was not popular.
Yeah.
And then it's almost like a bad irony for you guys that 8 years later they have full control over it again, when that perhaps wasn't the reason they were reelected. That there was sort of everything, other reasons got them reelected, and now they have the chance to do this again. Can you make political gains or because of this if they keep going down this path? Because again, I mean, they're in full control again, even though they did that law 8 years ago.
I totally agree with the historical analysis is an interesting one, and I had not thought about it before. In other words, they passed these tax cuts, and the last time, and in the next couple elections, it didn't help them at all. They didn't run on them. In fact, we ran on them, which is kind of unusual for tax cuts, but they were so heavily weighted toward the wealthiest people that they couldn't run on them. And the American people's intuition was, this doesn't feel right to us. I think that's where they're gonna be again on that. Donald Trump was not on the ballot in those earlier years as he was in the last, and in this campaign, he was able to do what he did before, which is stand there in front of the American people, almost, declaring his own corruptness in front of the American people. I mean, nobody in America doesn't think the guy's not corrupt, but he's managed to send a signal that says, at least I'm honest about my corruption. Unlike the Democratic Party and unlike the Republican Party, the American people said, you know what, who are fed up. I mean, 70% of them are saying we need a radical transformation of the American economy, in part because the conditions persist that I was talking about earlier, which is income inequality is getting worse. People feel like no matter how hard they work, they can't move their families ahead. And they're like, let's send a wrecking ball to Washington, D.C. And that's what they've done. In the context of that happening, the Republicans and Donald Trump will not be able to help themselves cutting taxes for the very wealthiest people, because that is their playbook, blowing massive deficits into the nation's future, because that is their playbook, failing to invest a meaningful way in the American people themselves, because that's their playbook. And again, he may be able to overcome all of that with his mastery of politics and even consolidate his political power. That's one way this could go. Or we could push back in a coherent way. It makes it hard for us to push back, though, when there are Democrats saying they want the SALT deduction put back in the tax code, 70% of which goes to the wealthiest people in America. I don't understand why Democrats would make that case. And yet there are a bunch on the coast of the country who are saying, we want to do that. It's hard to have a coherent message that you're fighting for working people, that you're fighting for the middle class, when that's part of your tax policy.
I mean, your own leader says that.
Huh?
Your own leader says that.
Well, I've heard rumors about that. And my issue there is I've said this to my leader, which is that I don't, not that he cares what my objection is, but I will say I have no objection to him fighting the good fight based on parochial politics of saying this is good for New York and I'm for this. This is good for New York. I don't have any objection to that. It's when they say I'm fighting for the middle class, that I have an objection, because it's the middle class and working people in Colorado and all over the country whose kids are going to have to finance those tax cuts, 70% of which are going to the wealthiest people in these East Coast communities. So our dispute might be one of rhetoric. Well, that's not true. It's a substantive dispute.
Substantive and rhetoric.
And rhetorical. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you were able to call me out on my friend Chuck Schumer while I was sitting here today. But
You won't see
we
it.
are friends.
It's fine. It's
Yeah.
well, we have run out of time, Senator. This was great.
Thanks for
doing
having me.
And
I
appreciate it. Yep.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
That's great. Yeah,
Thanks.